Evening, good morning. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, for the small technical delay here. Murphy can be a real jerk sometimes, so apologies for that. So for those who bared with us and are still with us, let's just kick this off. So again, welcome. My name is Ricardo. I'm the managing partner for Arthur Lawrence Middle East and Africa, and I also lead the global CX practice. Some of you are rejoining from our last session, but for those who are new, Arthur Lawrence is a Houston headquartered management consultancy company. Since its inception, we have been focusing on one thing and one thing alone, which is really to create value for our partners and clients by combining technology and human ingenuity. In the first webinars, we talked more general about the AI implications, AI from a dynamic perspective in the industry. And we were talking about a couple of verticals and sectors. And then we decided to really focus our efforts in the next webinar on customer experience, and which is an area which is quite close to me as well. I've been in the CX space for quite some time, on the BPO side, on the buyer side. And AI, similar to RPA and other projects, that has been really a tough discussion. But what's happening now, and I'm joining this call from Dubai, so I hope the voice is audible. There's so much investment, so many changes right now. The GC itself is investing more than $100 billion in AI over the next couple of years. That's almost 10% of its GDP. Abu Dhabi, I think, is one of the main investors with almost 100 billion. Saudi Arabia, for those of you who have been in LEAP last week, the week before, and have seen some of those tech dynamics, it has all been about AI. AI is really a game changer. It's here to stay. And what we're trying to focus on for this webinar, and at least for the time which is left, is to really go a little bit more in depth on how we believe AI can be deployed, what are the challenges, but also what are the opportunities here. And I'm really happy to also introduce Rudy and Amer. Rudy and Amer, they lead the AI practice for Arthur Lawrence, and they are what I call AI Sherpas, really, and they will really guide us through this process. For those, because we have people from different continents, I think we have over 500 people who are joining this webinar. Some are CX specialists, others are buyers, others are tech, some investors, some are decision makers. So it's really difficult to create a narrative which will fit to everybody. So please bear with us, and we will try to guide you through this. Some of you may have heard of Klarna. It's Klarna is a small Swedish organization, a loan company, a fintech, and they announced some time ago that they partnered with OpenAI for their chatbots. And what happened is that they claimed, and they sent out a press release, basically confirming that the bot was so successful that it replaced over 700 resources, really, saving $40 billion and making it a huge success. Now, that created quite a wave for those who have heard, who are in the BPO market. Some of the largest BPOs stocks crashed, really. Organization like TP, I think they crashed by almost 30% in stock value. Webhelp, Concentrix, 11%. Why? Because people are looking at AI chatbots more serious now. They're not chatbots on steroids anymore. Large language models have really changed the game. What we're trying to do over the next 30, 40 minutes is to really see how it's deployable and what are some of the pitfalls here as well. So there's no longer ado. Let me pass this on to Rudy and Amer, and let's walk through this.
All right,
Rudy,
well,
all yours.
Thank you, Ricardo. So Klarna is is an interesting example, a clear-cut success story. And if you kind of look at what they've done, is they've done a really good job at executing on that chatbot. It's not some new technology that has made this happen. It's just that they have done good job at executing it. They have the right types of guardrails. The chatbot is narrowly focused in its responses, and is not really intended for complex tasks, but really humans are still used if there's like a more complex aspect to be addressed. And it's also not perfect. Like it still has issues. The chatbot will make mistakes from time to time, and they are monitoring it continuously and performing against human, comparing it against human performance. So
I actually reached out to some of my contacts in Sweden because it did create quite a buzz, and also reached out to some of my contacts at TP. I used to work for Majorel. And in reality, it's not as smooth as a ride as they claim, right? So with all the improvements on some of the KPIs, I think the average handling time dropped significantly to less than 2 minutes. But for those who are in the CX space, you also understand that it's not necessarily those technical KPIs which define the experience. It's somehow between those nuances. So I'm really looking forward to seeing more details, and really, it's probably also too early to judge if it was a huge success or not. I do believe it takes at least a couple of months to really measure the client feedback, the experience. I don't know if they measure NPS or satisfaction, but I think it's probably very early to judge. But what we know it has done, it has really changed the game. It has woken up the people. It has created, I think, a momentum and a window of opportunities for tech companies to really move in the customer service. And it's probably waking up also those BPOs, which have been rather, say, complacent, to really invest and implement chatbots.
Yeah. So part of the reason why they might have been asleep is because um, the Klarna type of story has not been very typical of a chatbot story up until now, and it's also something to think about that now we have one. It's not just one success story. There are other success stories out there, and as experts in this field, we can tell you that it is possible to have under reasonable assumptions to have a decently working chatbot, one that can be used in a responsible manner, as long as it is implemented properly and the execution is quite right. So I have here a few examples of there are success stories out there, but just as there are success stories, there are also some disastrous stories you can come across. Like this one example of Air
Yeah, I saw
Canada.
that one.
They were kind of rushed. Well, they deployed the chatbot like everybody else was excited about this technology as it was coming out. In this particular case, the chatbot made up a refund policy as it was talking to a client. This client had kind of a very particular story, and as it says here in this this subtitles, that they were arguing that they would not be liable for what the chatbot made up. Now the court didn't agree with them, so they ended up having to pay for this made up refund policy. And it's a cautionary tale, like how eager are you to jump on the new technology without it being properly implemented and vetted? And so, yes, it is possible to do this the right way, but the success is not guaranteed, and you have to be really careful how you go about it. And I did find, there's countless examples of this, both success stories as well as stories like this. This is a more lighthearted one where a Chevy dealer put out a chatbot, and this person went on and basically was able to tell the chatbot how to instruct the chatbot how to talk, like the core instructions you would give to a chatbot. He told this chatbot that everything that the chatbot says should append that it's legally binding, and then it basically asked it for a $1 car, and the chatbot agreed. Now, in this case, there was no lawsuit. It was clearly intended to be kind of lighthearted to test the limits of the chatbot. But again, the guardrails didn't work here. And so while this is a funny example, the consequences can be serious. Now, the Air Canada example, they didn't have to pay a whole lot. But imagine if this was happening, at scale, this can be really risky. And so, yeah, this is
like
just
in the last webinar, I think we also discussed healthcare, right? And such cases in liability, especially in healthcare or telemedicine, where we really want to implement chatbots to replace a certain medical treatment, that's going to be a whole different ballgame. So I agree with you. It comes with risks, but you need those security tracks. But also, I think it's a good notion because people will have to know that they're liable as well, right? There needs to be some kind of regulation.
So, if you look at this, and this has been kind of the story of large language models and ChatGPT over the last, this has been out for a while now, that, like, it's not like you would think that everybody would be adopting it left and right, but these are sort of the cautionary tales that are, making this, much slower. And then seeing how a company goes, and makes it successful is valuable piece of information, at least for that industry, and also, people beyond that. So,
and you mentioned a good point, because we keep on mentioning ChatGPT and OpenAI. Over the last couple of weeks, and you've been in some of those journeys with me, we've met so many different chatbot companies, AI companies, and boutiques, and Indian, Pakistanis, Eastern Europeans. Now, there's so many different type of models as well, right? I think a lot of the noise disappears if you start focusing on very specific models. And I think there are also very competitive alternative platforms and models now in the market, and they keep on coming up like mushrooms. So I think the competition is also going to be extremely strong, and it's going to allow us probably to leverage more similar technologies, probably even more agile. As they come from boutiques, they have probably less dependencies.
Well, that's really kind of the core question here. How do we get to, what does it take to get value out of conversational AI, given the landscape as it is? So companies are coming up left and right. There's startups, they're doing things. There are different models. So, in this sort of a uncertain environment, how do you create a strategic plan to execute on conversational AI? Because there's definitely value there. So that's really what we're trying to do within this session. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a comprehensive view of what it takes to deploy a conversational AI solution. And then we want to go through the various use cases, kind of go through who some of the vendors are, and what aspect of these use cases generative AI can cover, and what the benefits are, and what some of the challenges and risks are, so that we kind of have a better understanding of how we can how we would go about guiding somebody towards success in an environment that's as uncertain as this. I think that the very first thing to note would be that to get value out of conversational AI in a customer service / customer experience environment, it's rarely a matter just of a chatbot or a particular large language model technology. Typically, there is a whole lot more moving pieces involved, a much bigger picture that matters, that you have to take into consideration to drive success. Obviously, the model itself matters. Obviously, it matters that you have the proper guardrails in place, as we have seen. So you do not want it to just make up anything. But the question is, how does a typical environment, sort of within customer service operate? The very first thing to note is that usually there are multiple channels through which a customer can communicate with an organization. Phone calls would be one, emails would be one, text messages would be one, and then the chat capability is usually available on websites. And this Klarna story has been focused on the chatbot. But really, if you kind of look at the more comprehensive picture, customers communicate with an organization through multiple channels. So that realization is one aspect of it. And so once you realize that, there is a need to manage all these communications and kind of keep track of the customer journey and understand what the customer has communicated through these channels and kind of connect the dots. And so usually, within these environments, you will not just have a single chatbot. There will usually be some kind of a omni-channel management tool or CRM system that has this ability to basically track interactions across these channels, and trying to piece together a more comprehensive picture of what customer needs or wants. And usually these tools will have things like tracking of sentiment, so that if issues arise, you can kind of figure out bad sentiment in real time. So that's kind of the management piece of it. And then when it comes to the chatbot or the conversational piece, usually there's a piece of technology that's dedicated to that. So OpenAI partnered with Klarna, and they have used ChatGTP, and that was sort of the conversational AI technology. But this could be pretty much anything, and it's not like these types of systems didn't exist before ChatGTP was released. They did exist. It was just focused more on traditional natural language NL, natural language processing type of methods, or natural language understanding methods. Now, OpenAI and ChatGTP have changed the game in the sense that they've created something that is capable of generating human-sounding language much more naturally. And so that's really one big thing that has changed. But looking at thinking about a more comprehensive picture, beyond having this ability to manage all these interactions and interface with the customer, we got the conversational AI system, which could be multiple systems. So think of, we're talking about chatbots here, but you might be processing each one of these channels. You might be doing something with voice. You might be doing something with email. So it will not necessarily all be one and the same tool. Now, beyond this, there are two other components that are really important. One is, what I call here the knowledge base, or be really the knowledge that you have about your business. So if somebody asks Klarna a question, it will be a question about their business. So the knowledge is not completely contained within this chatbot. The chatbot has to go out and retrieve the answer from their documentation, from manuals, from various pieces of information that the company owns. And typically an agent in a call center would be doing this through some kind of a search. Now, the chatbot does that, and it retrieves the answer. So the point being here is, if you do not do a good job in organizing the knowledge within your business, your chatbot is not going to do well. And so these are the types of things that may not be highlighted when you're talking about Klarna, the success stories, the failures, because a lot of it frequently boils down to the failures frequently are about the guardrails. The chatbot made up something, it answered some crazy question it shouldn't. Very frequently the failures around that. Sometimes it makes up things that are not crazy, like the refund policy, but they're still not real. And so that would be one example where you ask yourself, well, in that case, you have a chatbot, and then there's supposed to be a knowledge base. So there should be something that captures all those policies, so that even as the chatbot is answering, that you could go in and validate and check which refund policy are we referring to. So, and this is one thing that a lot of companies that think about implementing chatbots don't put a lot of attention to, or don't emphasize enough, in that you really need to get your data in an appropriate state before you can get value out of a chatbot. And appropriate state, what that means here is the relevant questions, they need to be easily retrievable. So if I have a question about a refund policy, I should not have to go through like 10 hops in your knowledge base or database to figure out the answer. It should be right there. And so that's one of the suggestions, or one of the core components of a more comprehensive conversational AI approach is knowledge management organization. The other part of it I have down here may sound more boring: enterprise systems. Well, why does that matter? It provides context. If you have a customer and they placed an order, they purchased certain things, what interactions you had with the overall enterprise system matter. They give you context. They give context to the chatbot. And so if you do not have the right integrations in place, the chatbot may not be aware of it. And so that's why that's important as well. Usually a CRM system, will be focused on, managing the relationship with the customer. It will not have, purchase orders, all kinds of things that may also be relevant.
Okay.
So this is kind of really a simplified view. Like it says a lot of components in it, but it's a simplified view of what matters when you're thinking about deploying a conversational AI solution. And so let's think about some more specific use cases within this, setup.
But it also shows, Rudy, this
Yeah.
complexity is that there's a disconnect between the expectations. And I think there's a very simplistic way for many prospects or many organizations who want to implement this. I mean, as there's so many moving parts, it's not just about the conversational AI system. It's not about just the knowledge base. It's also how it's integrated. And in many cases, what type of channel is being used. And then also one thing which I've seen a lot over the last couple of months is why you want to implement it, right? I mean, are you implementing when they come and say, I want an AI bot? Is it because you want to replace or reduce costs? Is it because you want to add value? Is it because you're trying to fill a certain gap? And then once you understand the vision and the target, then I think it's probably easier to implement such a solution. It needs to be fitting in the ecosystem, but I think it needs to have an objective, a clear objective, which cannot just be about cost saving or replacement.
You are right, Ricardo, as far as that goes. And it's actually one of the key factors in whether you're not, at least with the current technology. So the current technology is not some kind of a general artificial intelligence. It works better when it is focused. So having an objective helps. Even having a narrowed focus as far as what the chatbot is intended to serve helps. So when you narrow these things down, then it's easier to guardrail. It's easier to validate the system, as opposed to having a very generic system like that Chevy dealer was like, oh, what can we help you with today? It's like you can ask anything under the sun. Whereas, like maybe this is a chatbot just to ask questions about invoices, and anything that's not invoice related, I can flag immediately, and I don't even get into that. So this is not the same as the objective that you mentioned, but focus is really important. So yeah, and even the examples we went through kind of illustrate this. Is like we have OpenAI. It was pretty much just probably the same technology used by most of these. You have one company that's successful. You have another company that is like the opposite. And it's the same chatbot. So you can't go and say, oh, this is a good chatbot, this is the good technology or the bad technology. It's really those moving pieces, how you integrate it, and like how you execute it, that make all the difference in the world. So let's go through some specific use cases of where and how conversational AI gets used. So one example would be, this would be something I would call a lower hanging fruit, where you use conversational AI to process messages. This could be email messages or SMS text messages. So here, you're not in a back and forth conversation with a client. Instead, you get the message and you have some time to process it. And then the agent, the way it would be used. So there's multiple ways in which an agent can be used here. One would be to route the messages to the right place. So maybe you have different departments. I mentioned invoicing. Maybe you have one for RFQs or quotes. And so depending on what the customer is asking, you can use a large language model to route route the message to the appropriate place. The more effective use of it is if the topic is very focused and you use the agent to automate some responses at least. So let's say you're asking about invoices, and 60% of our questions about invoices are kind of similar in nature. So you build a bot to answer those, the easy questions, and you, along with that, incorporate some kind of a confidence scoring mechanism so that when the agent responds, you have a level of confidence. Is how confident are you that this is correct? And then you can utilize a confidence scoring mechanism like that to decide whether or not to automatically respond or to route the question to a human being, to an agent to respond. And there are companies that have implemented this successfully. When it's focused on a particular topic, it can save quite a bit of effort. It's basically messages that maybe typically would have been manually answered. You might cut them down by 50 or 60%, and so that can have a big impact. And it's not even like a complete chatbot. It's really just a sophisticated, a large language model that answers a single question. So moving on. So this would be one example. Now, another example would be a chatbot, but this would not be the Klarna chatbot. This would be a different chatbot. In this setup, we have a call center agent, and typically these call center agents, they get calls all the time, and then they have to very quickly retrieve relevant information to answer these questions. And sometimes they'll have tools to search. And so the idea here would be to have a chatbot that the agent can use to more effectively retrieve relevant information. So there's a question about invoices, while the agent is talking, even without the agent typing it, if you are listening in on the call, you could immediately bring up relevant information. The reason this is relevant or helpful is, one, it helps the agent get the right information in front of them. So you gain in speed and in quality of the responses. But the other important aspect of this is you still have a human in the loop. So if the agent comes up back with some really crazy answers, if you have if the chatbot comes back with some crazy answers, the human agent can hopefully intercept that and not forward them to the client. So that's really it is a slightly more challenging setup than the previous one, but this is not as difficult of a setup as when you have a completely customer-facing chatbot, because again,
which is a fallback scenario or fallback solution, which, by the way, the Klarna chatbot is using as well, or the voice bot. Right, there are agents behind it, so you have the choice to actually talk to the human agent.
They are, but it's
and they
not
can listen
this
in
setup. So it's common to have this setup where it gets delegated to the agent when something goes wrong. In this setup, the chatbot is never directly talking to the client. So there's always the human in front. The Klarna setup is actually the most messiest setup, or the most difficult setup. They've made it easier by narrowing the focus of what it's discussing. So it's not talking about anything. It's very tailored to payments people have made and whatnot. But it's really this type of a setup where we have a customer service chatbot that interacts with the customer. And if this chatbot is not able to answer something or detects that there's issues, it would automatically be flagged and routed to a person to resolve. Or similarly, the customer usually will have the ability to request that as well, and then it gets pushed to a customer service agent. The reason this is the most complicated setup is because customers can ask anything, and they can use any type of language to do it. And you really have to be careful here because your response immediately goes to the client. But the benefit as illustrated by that Klarna example, there's various things you can accomplish with this, including, reducing the resolution time. You can save in terms of the number of agents you need. You can improve the quality of the services. One thing also that they mentioned multiple times is multilingual support. Like, I think they support about 35 languages with that chatbot. And that means a lot as well. It's not just, it's difficult enough to have to maintain a call center, but then having to serve multiple regions, makes that even more complicated. And so if, that is another benefit. Moving on. Now we've covered a number of different use cases. There's yet another one, which would be a voice assistant. So most people already, to some degree, are familiar with, Siri, Alexa, Hey Google, all of that. With the emergence of large language models, there's a whole new generation of these assistants that are even better in, talking to a person. This allows you, to use your voice, which is more natural. That's the benefit of it. But there's also another challenge. There's various different ways in which people talk. When you write something, you can immediately get what they're saying, but maybe they have an accent, maybe they're not articulating things, the right way. Well, not articulating, but maybe they're not speaking very clearly. Maybe there's background noise. So with the voice component, there's an added challenge here in the processing. And so that's what makes this type of an agent even more challenging. Because if your responses are too slow, the person will get annoyed, and that actually happens. Like a lot of us have picked up the phone, and it's kind of a half-baked voice assistant, if you will. Sometimes you get options, but sometimes when you get that assistant on the phone, they'll ask you, "Oh, why don't you tell us what you want?" And me, as somebody who does have an accent, I can tell you there is a number of these that don't work out for me, where the voice assistant is just not getting it. And then it gets even more frustrating when it doesn't get that I want to talk to a human. So it can
probably your
evolve.
Central European German accent versus my Austrian dialect, or a Swiss dialect. Yeah, I think a lot of nuances. Agreed. But I think there are also a couple of questions which came in. So I think Ahmed is going to put them on the chat, and then we can also respond to some of those.
Do you want me to pause, or do we get back to those later?
Yeah, I think once we get them on the chat, then we will address them.
All right. So moving forward, now we've gone through progression of more and more and more difficult. Others even more difficult. Now this isn't a chatbot, but it's relevant for customer service and for call centers. Simultaneous voice translation. Now, sometimes this is called interpretation. This is very difficult. Now, what we're talking about here is a person is speaking, and in close to real time, the system is translating what I'm saying in English into German, let's say. And the other person is speaking in German, and the system is translating back to me in English. So we're talking to each other, kind of like, the universal communicator in Star Trek. If you follow that show, it's translating for people that don't speak each other's language. Now, why is that a big deal? Well, it's a big deal because this would allow you to have customer service agents that speak English, and they could serve the entire world without, having to have agents within every country. So it removes the language barrier. That's obviously very attractive. But to be able to do this type of translation so quickly and accurately, that is a challenge. And it's a different type of challenge than the chatbot. We'll get to that later on.
No, so it's definitely a game changer, right? And we've been discussing that on various platforms as well, and over the last sessions with potential partners and some of the existing ones. It is also a little bit the holy grail for the BPO, right? I mean, at the end of the day, most of the costs are generated, or the operating costs are really people. And then if you have additional languages, you need to set them up in various countries. So you start looking for multilingual hubs all over the world, Eastern Europe, Egypt, similar places, right? Now, all of this will be eliminated if you have the proper simultaneous voice translation tool. And I've seen a couple of use cases. I've seen a couple of examples, but there's still very few BPOs or organizations who are really deploying that. Why? On one thing, latency is always a question, right? It is not as smooth as people think, right? The same as when the Samsung phone came out, the latest one with the simultaneous translation. It's not fluid, right? It's not solid. And when you really start talking slang, and I tried it on various languages, it's not giving you the full solution. But then it's also a matter of business model, right? Imagine you are Rudy now together with your brother, and you own a large BPO with in 40 different countries. Now suddenly you need to think about your translation tool, and probably you can do that out of 4 or 5 countries. Now that changes the whole business model and your approach. So I believe it's still it's going to take some time, but we're working already on some of those solutions. But it's going to take a lot of buy-in from the client. I think it's going to take a lot of really connecting the dots to focusing on the right user cases. And then probably with the right tool, it's going to add value. But at the end of the day, it's also the client satisfaction or the experience which we need to count in. And that's still, I think, something which needs to be tackled.
So yeah, we will get back to this simultaneous translation later on. The technology is there to provide. So there are challenges on a phone, a Samsung phone. Hardware is one of the limitations. But if you didn't have that limitation, the quality that you can get with the current technology, say you had the proper data sets and the proper hardware, it can get pretty good to a degree that may be acceptable to businesses, where it's not chopped up, where it's not robotic, where it sounds human, but it's still a very challenging problem. We'll get back to that in a bit. I've seen two of the questions here. I will delay them for later because there's a segment of the presentation that kind of deals with some of this. So then we'll cover them when we get to that. Moving on. So now we're going to dive into some of the core technologies or core components that we have discussed here. We've laid out various use cases from what we would consider the lowest hanging fruit to something that's really like a challenging problem. So in particular, the three types of application areas we want to look at are chatbots, with chatbot being sort of one of the most popular things people are talking about, email or message handling, and then lastly, voice. So I'm going to cover chatbots now, and we'll get back to these two questions. There's a section on knowledge retrieval, and then we'll cover the two questions here. All right. So when it comes to chatbots, I will not, just kind of skim through this. We've already looked at all the benefits that Klarna has been advertising. We've also looked at some of the risks that have happened, such as made up things, hallucinations, potential liability, people getting annoyed, and then bias is one that we haven't talked about a whole lot, but that would be like if your agent starts discriminating people, if your agent starts recommending suboptimal care to people depending on what the ethnicity they are, just because they're a minority. That can happen, and it can happen not out of intention. It's just that the nature of a lot of AI models are such that if you have a group that is much more frequent than another group, you actively have to account for that. Otherwise, by default, your model is going to discriminate. So that's, there's other areas where algorithmic approaches are used to handle something that affects humans, like job search. When you have 1,000 candidates, a lot of these companies are using AI-based tools to surface the most relevant candidates. And there's your, a huge opportunity for, well, bias and discrimination. So those are very relevant things. And those are things that you have to account for, especially if you have something that's really customer facing or that's affecting people. Moving on. So let's take a look at some of the vendors that exist in this space. So if you're thinking about building a conversational AI solution, a chatbot, and you're thinking to do that within an enterprise environment, you're going to ask yourself, should I be building this thing from scratch? Or is there maybe something that I could leverage out there? It's really kind of if your objective is to solve a problem, the question is, do I piece together solutions, or do I piece together some solutions and build some of them? How do I make that determination? And obviously, to be able to make that, you have to have some of an understanding of what's available out there. And I'll just mention a few. Amazon has a framework called Amazon Lex, which allows you to build agents, which then integrate with the entire Amazon ecosystem. And in particular, they have a framework called AWS Connect, which is a software environment specifically for call centers. So that's the Amazon side. It's a generic framework. So even if a completely new generative AI model were to come up, it is flexible enough that you could integrate that model into this framework and start playing with it immediately within your broader environment. So that's one of the benefits of it. But one of the downsides is that it's great to start building things quickly, but as you're building the bot, you're going to find that you're relying on a lot of different services, which happen to have to be hosted on Amazon. And so Amazon ends up making a whole lot of more money on all these different services you have to run on it compared to the agent itself. So cost is an issue here if you go full in. OpenAI is another category I have here. They're not really a vendor for call center agents, so nothing here is call center specific. They're not handling omni-channel type of things, which Amazon, by the way, has capabilities to do that. This AWS Connect tool will do omni-channel management for you, and so all of that is in place. OpenAI doesn't have any of that, but they're in here because Klarna partnered with them, and they're just providing the large language model technology, or the chatbot system, really. And yeah, you can think of them as a player in the space, especially if you're thinking about building a custom or utilizing a generative AI solution, more like one of the most recent types of things that are out there. Now, there's another category of companies. One of them is called Omnibot. This is an interesting framework. It's an entire framework for conversational AI. If you think about that comprehensive picture we showed, they're less focused on the CRM aspect of things and more on the agent itself, the knowledge management and the conversational agent. So their bot can handle both text and voice, and has the ability to define dialogue flows and decision rules, and includes some aspects of knowledge management, where you can kind of that part that we said was really important. So that's kind of an interesting framework because it addresses a lot of these things. I'd say when it comes to knowledge management, none of the other two, most frameworks do not address that directly. Like if you were building something with OpenAI, you would have to build a model that that you would be taking care of the knowledge management yourself. And similarly, there are tools within the Amazon ecosystem to do this with, but it's not like baked into Amazon Lex. So moving on.
Which is a bit a David versus Goliath. Huh? Yeah. Compare OpenAI multi-billion versus Omnibot. Omnibot is more of a boutique. We know them quite well. It's one of our partners. We use them also for one of the larger BPOs to create a bot for the BPO. But unfortunately, it didn't get much traction, but also predominantly because of, I think, a lack of overlapping business models. But I think what's interesting on this picture is that it shows that also the playing field is leveled nowadays. You can be a boutique in a niche and still make a difference and have a different framework, right? And still be profitable and grow with that, versus a large organization which has a different funding mechanism.
Definitely. So if you're looking at vendors out there, there's nuanced differences between them, size being one of them, their focus being one of them. So Omnibot, out of these three, Omnibot is probably the most heavily focused on call centers, because that's where they originated. But like OpenAI is like completely generic. Then question of what kind of capabilities come out of the box, with like some of them having very tailored things that a call center would need, others have nothing. Integrations that are available, and you mentioned that integrating with enterprise systems and other types of systems is an important aspect. Some of them have more of that, some have less. And then also the question is, if you have a custom model, so let's say you're chasing after the latest large language models, the question is going to be, can I even deploy that model within that framework? So depending on what vendor you're looking at, you're going to get different answers to these questions. And it's not just these three vendors. As Ricardo mentioned, Omnibot is a partner, and I borrowed this slide from them, actually these next two slides. This one here kind of gives a more detailed picture of what Omnibot does or what it's about. And you can see this is not just this, like the chatbot itself. It has the knowledge management piece to it. I mentioned the decision engine, focus on voice analytics and speech recognition, because they're able to do voice as well. They need to be able to process voice signals, and then various types of.
I think that's actually where they come from, right? One of the co-founders was the chief scientist, I believe. Also put up the Alexa platform. He was running that as a project, so that is very strong voice capability.
Yeah. So you can kind of see that we have chatbot, voice bot, virtual assistant, various ways in which can be used, and then the integrations and the connectors. So this is I like this framework. It's interesting because it has a very tailored focus. They're not trying to be everything, and they're doing a good job at what they're focused on. And so very frequently, you're looking at other companies, there's going to be aspects of what you need that you may have to build or may have to get elsewhere. And so, that's really what it boils down to when you're looking at them. So I have one more slide from them here that illustrates the landscape of, for this industry for conversational platforms. And so there's a whole lot more than just three. And what they've done here is they've kind of segmented this into three categories, one being speech to text players, which would be companies that just do speech to text. They're not necessarily focused on call centers, but that just happens to be a technology that can be used for these purposes. And so they're in here as well. Then there are companies that are building more of a conversational platform, and companies that are focused on contact centers. So sorry, as you can see here, there's a whole lot of them. And
yeah. Probably by now that those numbers have doubled.
Yeah,
I've seen this one last year.
Just navigating this and trying to understand, given your requirements, if I'm not building something from scratch, should I be buying, and what should I be buying, and how quickly are these going to be out of date? Like, how solid is the foundation of this technology? Is that going to be something that's relevant in 2 years, or am I going to be switching to something new then? So those are all very relevant questions. All right, so we've talked about vendors, chatbots. Now generative AI is something that comes up a whole lot and that is dominating the discussion. Within generative AI, currently the state-of-the-art approach to use is called graph-based retrieval augmented generation. And so what happens there is you basically, when the user asks a question or the client asks a question, you take this question and go to your knowledge base and try to retrieve relevant documents. Once you get those relevant documents, you then take your original question and the relevant documents and you pass it along to the large language model. And that is basically, how this works. Is you're trying to get the correct context, the answers to your question up front, and then the large language model is supposed to just kind of summarize the answer. So if I'm asking about, a particular insurance, then idea would be I'll bring up all the manuals and all the documents that I need on that insurance, and then the answer would be contained within these documents. And so I then just tell the agent, the large language model, just tell me the answer. The one thing that is added here that some diagrams may not have, you're going to see multi-agent systems here. So that is kind of a more recent development where you don't just use one large language models, you might use multiple to improve accuracy. And it could be either multiple collaborative language models or agents, or it could be where you have a purpose-built language model, let's say, as I was mentioning before, one for invoicing, one for orders. And so when a question comes in, it gets routed to the language model that's intended for that purpose. So that's kind of the most recent type of development. This is taken off as the most successful approach because it actually works without having to necessarily retrain or fine-tune the model, because you're just using it for summarization. Now, some companies will do this and then do summarization as well. Now, one thing I will note is this is called graph-based. So a technology that is utilized to make this happen is called knowledge graphs. And so it's not just knowledge graphs, it's also vector-based indices of text documents. And those two combined are currently the state of the art. They're the leading company for graph databases is called Neo4j, and they were they basically implemented this ability to combine vector indices and a knowledge graph and allow you to retrieve information in that way. Since then, there are other vendors that have added this ability, but that's kind of it. And as Ricardo was kind of mentioning that it's now possible for even smaller companies to make an impact, this type of an approach is not very expensive. And so, yes, you do not have to spend millions of dollars training models to just get this up and going. So even a startup can build, a very robust chatbot system. The thing that is more relevant than whether you're training the model is how well do you retrieve the information, how do you represent your knowledge, and how well do you capture mistakes. So validation, confidence scoring, and then guardrailing. Guardrailing means just discarding things that should never be a response. And confidence scoring is important so that you have a sense of how much trust can I put into this. With there being a knowledge graph, you have an added way to validate. You can go to the knowledge graph and check. If we're saying this is a refund policy, I go here and I check that refund policy. So I have a way to interface with my knowledge. That is the state of the art. I will now stop here, and Amer will take over. I will talk about email.
Thank you, Rudy. Hi, guys. Can you move to the next slide?
There you go.
So Rudy was mentioning these several different channels, chatbots being first one, email and voice are right after them. Emails, you don't have to explain too much about the benefits and risks. What I would like to say is that email is an established medium of communication, and what it offers kind of very quickly to you is the ability to extract these structured data insights. And throughout this conversation that we are having, I always keep thinking about it. So we're looking at these systems. We're talking where can they go wrong? Well, wherever they can go wrong, they'll go wrong consistently. So keep that in mind, right? If you put a person somewhere, the person gets tired, and their consistency varies over time. But these systems, if they make mistakes, they make them systematically. Yeah, consistency is actually, I consider it a benefit. For email, as you probably know yourself, the risks, I would say the biggest ones are that they become what they are, that they become spam, that you rely too much on them, that they lack personalization, and you basically start discarding them, right? If you're getting too many of them, they become less impactful, and there is very little feedback. You do not know, there's no back and forth. It's in one direction. But overall, the email channel for conversational AI, I think it's a low-hanging fruit, especially this idea of using it, and has been used. So it has been used by now even outside AI for spam detection. So you can think about extending that idea of a filter, of a spam filter, into enriching it with AI, and to provide more intelligent routing policies. So yeah, next slide, Rudy. When you're looking at the email channel, yeah, the first option is actually coming up, handing it over to a chat, a bot, an AI bot that will do something similar to what it does with the chat bot. Another thing is rolling it kind of from zero, from scratch, and that is more in the domain of power automation. It requires more customization. It gives you more flexibility, of course. You do not have to, the chatbot or a system that would be able to hold the discourse through email, like Rudy mentioned, guardrails should be posted everywhere you go, right? The guardrails are the way through which you control the chatbot. Otherwise, it kind of flies wherever it wants to. So guardrails, or the ability to control these intelligent systems, is, I cannot emphasize how important that is. It's the one place where you can, you can control this system and make sure that it does what it needs to do. Yeah, next page, Rudy. Yes, and then the most, I would say, the most complex and the most promising avenue is going this route of AI bots, and then applying what Rudy mentioned, these multi-agent systems, to kind of provide targeted responses to certain situations, and then have the ability to hand it over to a human or elsewhere. But this idea, I mean, we like this idea of multi-agent systems a lot, and I think there is a lot of benefit that can be gained from them. Yes. Next.
So I would just add to that like in this particular example of handling emails, it's multi-agent systems, but it's also the potential to use very small large language models. Like, you do not have to use 70 billion parameter large language model. You can use a 7 billion parameter language model that is trained for a very specific task. So this whole routing and manage, like what you do with the emails, it can also be accomplished very economically.
Yeah. So then we come to the to voice, and voice is like Ricardo says, I think voice is going into, going towards that holy grail. And what would be the holy grail of this whole customer experience? It is a system that provides an utmost of customer experience. And what would that be? That would be an agent that talks your language. It talks your accent. It is basically, it puts you at rest, and it puts you at ease. So going that route, I think you need to have voice. You need to have voice that talks in your language, in your accent, in your dialect, at a tone that is kind of maybe reminding you of some peaceful times, and that is able to respond to situations where de-escalation is necessary. So it's not necessary to talk about the benefits, but of course you'll get a hands-free operation. It will be able to detect emotion and tone of your voice, and of course it will adjust itself so that it is that you're most comfortable with it, regardless of what you think of globalization, localization, whatever. The goal of this agent would be to be as suitable to you as possible, right? And the risks, I would say, they come up very often in funny situations, but I would say, besides liability, of course, it's that voice is somehow voice is frustration is a lot easier to develop in voice than it is maybe with emails or chatbots. Yeah. So what would be the next page, Rudy? Yeah, so here is what the usual setup looks like for a voice assistant. You need to capture voice, but at some point you need to think in concepts that are based on knowledge. And so one very important step is the ability to properly convert that speech to text and then reason over those symbols, those words, those sentences. And once you have produce the result, to be able to put that back into voice. And I would say more recently we've been looking at this project called Whisper, and it's really kind of showing the path forward, and it's really cool what it can do. Yeah,
I would just add to that there's been, so if you have a chatbot that works well with text, with this speech to text and text to speech, you can kind of turn it into a voice assistant. And the recent developments within speech to text and text to speech in terms of the quality have been pretty immense, so that it's actually, doable, quite doable. And if you install OpenAI or ChatGTP on your phone, it actually has the option for you to talk to it, and you can kind of play around with this and make it but it's not an assistant in that it doesn't really do anything for you, but just the conversational aspect, you can test that out and see how well you can talk to it.
One thing that I should mention is also speech to text or text to speech can benefit from whatever context you have deduced or you have discovered on the reasoning side. So they look like they are separate elements, and in most of the time they are. But if you integrate them properly, then a speech to text is going to maybe be influenced by the context in which you're discussing something to improve its recognition, or to produce better audio signal that comes out of it. Next, yeah. So one of these benefits, one of these features that are coming out of a voice channel is also simultaneous translation, and I would say accent removal. So simultaneous translation, like was mentioned already, opens up the ability for you to service different regions, people that are talking differently. There is always but, and the but is, of course, that it's not always about the language. It's also about cultural sensitivities, right? And so you will always need to have a backup plan. If you're talking to people in different parts of the globe, it would be nice if one could discuss it and have a simultaneous translation system. But at some point, that system would also have to take into account cultural sensitivities, right? Sometimes asking a direct question, like what happened to me, but asking a direct question can cause unintended consequences, right? So I've come across several different kinds of people from different parts of the world, and there are a few cases where to this day I do not know. I mean, I asked the direct questions, but the result was something I didn't expect, and this day I didn't figure out what in my tone or my question was questionable, but that's I would say that's a very big obstacle in this endeavor to provide simultaneous translation. Yes. So yeah. So but the benefit, one of the benefits from
Ricardo,
this page
you're
you can
muted.
see is, yeah, I'm muted.
No, Ricardo was saying something, but he's muted.
Oh.
Yeah, I
sorry.
was trying to say something while I was muted. No,
Oh.
I just wanted to add, Amer, that it's really crazy, especially those cultural nuances.
Yeah.
They are even within specific languages. You know, I'm based out of the Middle East, so we used to run centers where we had Kuwaiti people calling into Egypt or Emiratis calling into Bahrain, and there it's always an issue, right? I think
Yes.
something you mentioned earlier is critical. You know, it's assimilation. We want
Yes.
to speak to somebody who we can identify with, and that's going
Yes.
to be a whole new challenge in the nuances, right? In those really small details to really drive customer experience. So, fully agree.
Yes. Yeah, so in this page, it talks a little more about the technical difficulties. I will skip over that. The only thing I would like to draw your attention to is that simultaneous translations, just think about it. If you are hiring a human translator, I think at the United Nations or anywhere actually, there is usually a time limit. You hire them, and actually you hire several of them, because after a certain amount of time, they have to switch. They cannot stay with you for a long time, and that's a big, I would say, a big advantage of a machine if it could do this properly. Yeah. So next page.
All right.
Yeah. So in this space of voice vendors, Rudy mentioned already Omnibot. There are a couple of others. I think smaller companies could have a big impact here. Kudos, Alorica, Interprefy. Most of them so far have been working on a one-way on a system that will do this just in one direction. Bi-directional simultaneous is still a work in progress.
So I guess I would want to just mention here is that this is a challenging problem. And if you think about it, if you speak German, there are certain languages where the verb is at the end. And in English, it would not be at the end. So a human that translates, they're so good that they predict in their mind what that person is going to say. And so they say the word before it's actually spoken, if that makes sense. That's how challenging this task is. And so if you're building a system, you would have to kind of have the ability to predict ahead if you have two languages that have kind of different arrangements. And the other thing is, that it has to be so fast, and the question is how long do you have to listen to get proper context for translation? Is 1, 2, 3 words enough? And that by itself is a challenging issue. And so that's why, here where they say they're one directional versus bi-directional. Well, if you're doing one directional, so say somebody's at an event and they're giving a speech, that's one directional. You're just translating that person. Bi-directional is you have two people talking to each other, because when they talk to each other, the context of the meaning is like the complexity of that context is much higher. It goes back and forth, and that is a much more challenging piece. Now, one thing that's interesting, even with all of that, there are currently two companies that are claiming to offer this. One is called Interprefy, and the other one is Alorica. Interprefy is mainly focused on events, but they do claim to have a bidirectional system that can translate. And Alorica is actually focused on call centers.
I mean,
Yeah, we
Alorica is
don't
one
have
of
a lot
the companies I helped set up here in the Middle East and Africa. And we did listen to the use case for that. It's not as straightforward, right? It takes a lot of preparation. It takes a lot of data. And also it takes a very specific client, right? With a very limited amount of data as input, because you still have latency, right? Latency is still becoming, or still an issue. What is the acceptable level? Is it 50 milliseconds? Is it 150 milliseconds, right? The moment you go beyond 150, 200 milliseconds, it loses its natural touch. And then you don't want to have a discussion where you're waiting the whole time or anticipating, right? So I think we're still at a very early stage, but the way I see it, the amount of organizations who are now investing into this, of course, including us, are growing, and we will see far more use cases coming up, because it's just a financial advantage. There's too much opportunity here to not fully leverage simultaneous multi-language translations, because it is a game changer. So
Yeah.
what I see is that most BPOs and many boutiques as well will focus on this, and we're going to see a lot of new use cases coming up over the next couple of months and years. It's an interesting time.
Definitely is.
Yes. So I will just skip over this since we don't have a lot of time. I thought this was a really nice slide to mention. This company is trying to do what I just was talking about, trying to remove accents and get us even closer to this to this holy grail of simultaneous translation. In the next slide, the last piece that ties these channels together is this omni-channel customer relationship management. And in this next slide, Rudy, if you can move the next slide, I'm going to make it very quick. Omni-channel customer relationship management tries to bring everything together, right? The kind of one thing that we've assumed is there, but might not even be there, and might be related to this first question by Greg, is to be successful, you need identity resolution, right? Between all these different channels, you have to identify that you're talking about with the same person about the same thing. What I would just say about these omni-channel CRM systems is that I don't know to what degree they are aware of what they actually have here. It is a platform, and I usually grade it by the ability to expand or extend it, right? So we come in as smaller companies with maybe novel ideas, and they are a perfect place to put in new kind of models, new kind of algorithms. And the question always arises: how modular are these systems? How easily can I add my own little algorithm? How can I extend this platform that lets you switch between different channels and kind of track a journey of your customer and respond to that journey? So yes.
I guess I would just maybe add to this is when you look at that comprehensive picture, and there's very different players in place, and companies focus on different things, but connecting the dots is an extremely important aspect of it, and also having some kind of a tool that actually interfaces with the customer. It's one thing, like how sophisticated your chatbot is, but you need to have that ability. And so these types of systems play a key role in this entire ecosystem, which is, you track the journey of the customer, having the ability in real time to assess sentiment, having the ability to bubble up or draw the attention to issues at hand. And so, there are various companies out there, like the bigger players. Amazon here is a bigger player. Like obviously you're stuck with Amazon. Dialpad, I think Google invested in them, and so they're kind of a Google shop. So even though they're not Google per se, but they're also kind of a bigger player. Bright Pattern is a very interesting company that like it provides a good balance of capabilities and functionalities within the space, and it also happens to be a partner of Arthur Lawrence. So I can let Ricardo speak to that a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely about focus as well, right? I mean, Amazon Connect, or if it's Genesis or Dialpad or Bright Pattern, the question really is, what specific pain points do we want to solve? We can have a perfect chatbot, we can have a perfect technology, if we don't have a communication platform for our clients, the advantage disappears. The organization like Bright Pattern, they understand the customer focus. I mean, Michael, the founder of the organization, and these are people who created organizations like Genesis. There's a lot of focus on CRM. There's a lot of capability there, but it also allows really to deploy quickly at the right cost. It's about agility nowadays, you know, and also it's not all about the Fortune 500 companies who want to set up a CRM system or communication platform within their contact centers. You have SMEs as well who need agility, who want things to be implemented quickly. And I think it's also deployment, not only deployment costs, but deployment speed and focus, which is relevant. So yeah, I agree. It's a GUI. You cannot have a good chatbot but not have a good communication platform. Ideally is when you can integrate both, right? When you have the communication platform, but then you have modules which will allow you then to either go into a translation module where your agent can speak and understand various languages, who will have his support bot who will provide him all the relevant data he requires simultaneously because the system is listening into the calls, with a module which allows to do the sentiment analysis to really drive customer experience and do quality work, but also really managing the data properly. So yeah, agreed.
All right. Yeah, just bear with me. There we go. Okay, so now we are at knowledge retrieval. So I'll continue here, and this will be an opportunity to address the two questions that have come up. I will make this brief because we are, we've started late and we've been kind of going over time. But the question is, how do we organize knowledge, and how do we most effectively retrieve it? There isn't like a right or wrong answer here. You could dump everything into a data warehouse and kind of plan out where and how you put things, and then maybe you retrieve it from there. The more appropriate way to structure knowledge would be using a knowledge graph. And so if you think about systems like Wikipedia, that's one big knowledge graph. It organizes knowledge in terms of nodes and relationships. And so if you're looking at a particular fact, it looks like it's text written on the page, like, President Barack Obama was born in this, in this place. But in the background, it's a graph that organizes the knowledge that's important and that's relevant. And so the first question here from Greg is, what is a good technical architecture for a rule base to operate reasoning on knowledge base? I'm thinking if then else rules where conditions could be diagnostic, attributes, functions, react, reasoning, action, calls, right? Historic rule systems could have backward rule chaining for a problem diagnosis, and so on and so forth. If you think in terms of knowledge graphs, in more recent times, there's been an emergence of graph databases, which are native graph databases, and organizations are using knowledge graphs. But there's sort of two flavors of knowledge graphs. There's a more loose definition where you just kind of connect the dots and you traverse journeys within that environment. But then there's also this ontology-based knowledge graph. An ontology-based knowledge graph is a much more rigorous thing, and it's a typical way in which you capture knowledge and reason about knowledge. And so that would be one possible way to go to implement. So within an ontology is kind of a more formal way to describe how you capture knowledge. You would say, oh, I'm going to capture customers. I'm going to capture the fact that a customer bought a product. But then in addition to these types of things, an ontology has axioms. They're like rules that indicate how you establish relationships. And so that's where you get the opportunity to incorporate if-then rules. But your rules could be something more complicated as well. They could potentially be even probabilistic or fuzzy. What I'm saying is, in the way in which you infer knowledge could be rule-based, but it could also be based on machine learning, on AI. So that's a whole whole area of research by itself. How do we represent knowledge? I'd say that really the most serious places will implement ontologies and sort of this more formal way of doing things. The lower hanging fruit or easier part would be just even to have a knowledge graph. The problem is most organizations don't even ask themselves this question of how do I organize knowledge in my organization? And this has become more and more important because these RAG-based systems currently that are being used by large language models, they are about the same thing. You're representing your knowledge, and for them to work, your knowledge needs to be optimized for retrieval. It needs to be as easily retrievable as possible. And so that's, basically what you would be doing is you ideally would want to build a knowledge graph that captures the knowledge that is relevant for the conversation. And you want to make sure that the knowledge is captured in a way that it's shallow, so that if I have maybe you can't do it for every single question, but maybe for 60-70% of the questions, you get the answer right away, like within a hop, rather than having to traverse a lot of the branches or paths within your knowledge graph. And so that would be the a type of approach that I would suggest for Greg. The second question was how do you design the LLM chatbot to have memory of conversations with a customer over time, over many media channels for the same issue ID? Is there a reg lookup by issue ID to reload before starting a new conversation on the same issue? So here I would say, don't think about RAG as being defined of a particular way to search. So RAG started out with vector databases, but that's not really what RAG is about. It's just really what RAG is saying. It's let's combine search with large language models, and I'm not going to dictate how you're going to do search. So to answer this question, yeah, you can have RAG that looks by issue ID, that looks by anything. It could be looking at a knowledge graph. It could be looking at a data warehouse. So you could just completely in abstract terms think about it as search. And it just so happens that if you have a knowledge graph, that search ends up working pretty effectively. As far as the question about memory, now there are two systems out there that are kind of worthwhile to look at. OpenAI, these new assistants, they have an assistance API that they've released. As part of that, they do context management for you. So they keep a history for you so you don't have to do it. Well, the challenge is you don't get a lot of ability to, customize. Well, you can customize the history, but it's kind of trying to be smart and so take some load off of you. The other system that I think is interesting to look at as well is called LangChain, where the memory is kind of a module in itself. The reason I'm saying is that because when you look at that system, you realize it's a module. So how you manage memory can be something that's completely up to you. So if you have the need to, what does it say here, have a memory of conversations with the customer over time, over many media channels, so you build your own custom memory module, and you use that to basically, that's where you maintain your history, and you do it in your own way. So how you would design that module, well, that would be a more extensive conversations to be had, but think of it like a service. You could even have, it can be a module that's a service by itself that you kind of decide how you want to keep track of it internally, but it definitely can be done.
If I could just say something to this first question about Greg. So in my experience, these heuristic rule sets usually, there is nothing that prevents them, or they usually will evolve into entire mini languages. So if you're thinking about any kind of heuristic rules, they are in themselves a form of language. And any kind of language, especially the more structured it is very suitable for LLM evaluation, LLM reasoning. So here, one example is if you need to use LLM or ChatGPT to work with your proprietary data, right? You can train it using that data, and you can create your own model. But a much more easier way is to let the LLM reason over a SQL statements that access your data, right? So in that case, rules are the SQL language. And if the language is SQL in one case, it could be a heuristic rule set in another case. So.
Right. So this brings us to the end of today's session. I'll just kind of quickly recap. So main point of the day is to emphasize that success with conversational AI is not just a matter of a single chatbot or a chatbot technology. It involves a lot of moving pieces, a much bigger picture that's involved. Yes, the chatbot has to be executed properly. You have to make sure you have the proper guardrails. You have to make sure that you're careful about how it interacts with your client. But that being said, how you maintain knowledge about your organization, what kind of communication channels you like how you manage the communication channels, across, how you manage conversations across channels, all of those things are equally important. And so with these many moving pieces, getting a value is a matter of a strategic vision and understanding sort of this comprehensive picture and how all these pieces kind of affect each other. It's important to understand the nuances across vendors, because you're probably not going to be building everything from scratch. You might not have to build anything from scratch, depending on what it is you want to get done. And so having some guidance in terms of when to buy and when to build is really important. Also understanding where is it appropriate to utilize generative AI. A lot of these vendors out there now have generative AI on their roadmaps. Some of them are already coming up with tools. Do you build something of your own? Do you rely on somebody else? So a successful outcome is really about bringing together these individual pieces in a meaningful manner, and and align them with the specific challenges and needs that the client has. And that's kind of what we do with Arthur Lawrence. And with that, I'll leave it off to Ricardo.
No, thank you, Rudy and Amer. I see it a little bit like a large building which needs to be built, right? You need a strong project management office, right? Because there are just so many moving parts, and nowadays there's so much noise, right? Just Google up a chatbot supplier or provider or solution, right? You will be bombarded. So most of the question we get is really, how can we cut through that noise? How can we make sure that whatever we implement or we invest in terms of AI has, how the Germans say, a foot and a leg, right? It needs to be sustainable. It needs to fit our vision or our objective. And that's where I see most of the errors, is that the expectations are not properly managed. It's usually handled in-house from a project management perspective, right? Where it's very difficult to cut through the noise, right? Organizations like ours, we continuously benchmark, we continuously partner, we continuously focus and invest on what is next. And I think with your capability within Amer, we can really support putting complex projects together, in particular on the CX side. Because again, customer experience is not just customer service, right? It's expectations, it has many nuances. It's business experience. It's a combination of the employee experience, the customer experience, the user experience, the product experience, the supply experience. All of this needs to come together, and it's not a single chatbot which will solve an issue. All right. If the pain point is we need to be more efficient, or if the pain point is we need to reduce costs, or we need to add value, then you need to look at have a holistic approach to such projects, and you will need the right what I call Sherpas to guide you through those mountains of innovations and information which we found today. So I leave it at this. Rudy, again, thank you very much. Amer, for your inputs. We're going to have the next webinar probably 3-4 weeks. We still need to look at one of the areas we're going to focus on. Previous was more on general AI. There are already some requests coming in, maybe on healthcare, maybe we look at some use cases with some of our partners as well. So stay tuned, and really looking forward to meeting you all in our next webinar. So appreciate it. Have a great day, or good morning, or good day. Cheers.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.